Okay, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And welcome everyone. It's really nice to do something for the local community. I am a Rutlander. I live in Bisbrook, just outside of Uppingham, which is where my clinic is. I'm just going to tell you right now, I'm having a few tech issues with my current iMac. So if I suddenly disappear, I will be back. It just means my screen has gone black and I'm going to have to just shut down and restart. So just consider it a natural little tea break for you, decaf tea. We'll get on to why later. So just to introduce myself, so my name is Kirstie. I'm a Doctor of Public Health Nutrition. I'm a registered nutritionist and a registered functional nutritionist. They're through different governing bodies. I've been working as a nutritionist in various capacities for over 20 years now, mostly in child and young adult health, which is something I'm incredibly passionate about. My main areas of focus are what we call nutritional psychiatry. So that's the link between nutrition and mental health, and also Parkinson's disease. But I work for the Institute for Optimum Nutrition and Portsmouth University, and there I run 3 modules, one of which is functional nutrition, one is gut health, and one is immune health. So I do have interests in those areas as well. The little banner along the bottom is all of my current jobs. This is my clinic here in Bisbrook. This is my university work. I'm also a health coach at Second Nature, which is a digital weight management program that's all centered around behavior change in your relationship with food. And I'm also the lead public health nutritionist for an international consultancy company called Real World Health. So I just want to start with the definition of mental health. So when we think about mental health, we're thinking about our state of well-being. And someone who is in a good state of mental health is able to realize their ability, can cope with normal stresses of life, work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. We know that mental health affects our emotional, psychological, and social well-being, but it actually very much impacts our physical well-being, and our physical well-being very much impacts our mental well-being. And I'll be talking about that a little bit in this lecture. So if at any point anyone has a question, it is absolutely fine to unmic yourself and ask. If you want me to explain something again, that is fine. If you don't feel comfortable doing that on this talk, you can reach out to me at the clinic. You can just log on to the website and message me directly through there. My email is also on the clinic, and so is the clinic phone number. So either note down your questions and interrupt, that's honestly fine. Note them down and ask them at the end, or do reach out to me separately. So I just wanted to run through a few of the most recent statistics, and it really does demonstrate that anyone here that does suffer from any form of mental well-being concern, you are absolutely not alone. And we know from this study of over 2,000 people in 2020 that 58% of people experience stress at work, 63% at least mild symptoms of anxiety, and 58% at least mild symptoms of depression. When we look at the mind statistics, we know that mental health issues greatly affect our younger generation, with 1 in 6 young people having a mental health issue in 2020, and that was an increase from 2017 of 1 in 10. So it's not an issue that is getting better. We also know that socioeconomic status massively impacts the likelihood of someone to suffer from a mental health issue, and that people in the poorest fifth of the population are twice as likely of developing a mental health related issue compared to those on an average income. And more concerningly, as those in the youngest, the young people in the lowest income bracket are 4.5 times more likely to experience severe mental health issues than those in the highest bracket. So we do really need to think about where we target our resources. I don't have the most recent statistic on this, but the stat from 2016 was that over the course of that year, there were 5,688 suicides recorded in the UK, the majority of which were men. And we know that even in eating disorders, we see generally more prevalence of diagnosed eating disorders in females, but that there is a significant proportion of males that suffer from disordered eating and eating disorders. And of those suffering from disordered eating, the majority that do end up taking their own lives are male in that subpopulation. And then when we think about COVID and the impact that that has had, it's no surprise that 2/5 of the population reported in the UK household longitudinal study that they experience severely elevated risks of distress during the pandemic. And when we look at the difference in people with a clinically significant level of psychological stress, it went up 10% from 2019 to the start of the pandemic in 2020. And then you can see that that number fell over that summer as lockdowns eased up, and then went right back up again with the lockdown in January 2021. Concerningly, there was a report of 26% of responders with thoughts of self-harm and 8% of responders carrying out self-harm behaviours during the pandemic. So it really is something that we all need to be aware of, those of us working or volunteering. We really need to make sure we're supporting the right people and understanding everything that we can about mental health and how we can support it. And my focus in this is nutrition. So I just want to start with what we mean by nutrition. So it's really the process of taking food and breaking it down, so digesting it, and then absorbing it. So that means taking it across our gut wall and then utilizing it in the body for whatever it needs to be used for. And when we're talking about that, we're usually talking about for energy or for growth or for repair and our immune function or for metabolism. And that is really just for our bodies to function. And good health, and therefore good mental health, requires good nutrition. But we need to think about what that might mean on an individual level and what can impact our nutritional status. So many different factors impact our nutritional status. So first of all, our age. From when you were born, you require more energy per kilogram body weight than at any other time in your life because you are growing so incredibly quickly. And then as we start to get older, our nutrient needs change. And at different times of our lives, we need different nutrients for different functions. We need nutrients as we go into adolescence and we start puberty. We then need nutrients pre and during and post-pregnancy and into lactation. And then we need different nutrients as we go through into menopause and male menopause. Our state of wellness is massively important in terms of our nutrient status and our stress levels. When we are unwell, our body requires many more of the micronutrients, the vitamins and the minerals to function. And when our stress levels are high, we also need a lot more nutrients. Stress not only impacts our health directly by impacting our immune system and impacting our mental wellness, but it also impacts our gut health, which then has another knock-on effect on our mental wellness. And I'll go into that in a little while. We know that environmental factors impact our nutrient status, so exposure to toxins, whatever they might be, from plastic to perfume to petrol to heavy metals, whatever we are being exposed to, they get into our systems and they block up our little pathways, so we're not able to utilize our nutrients, and that is as important for the nutrients that make the substances our brain needs as much as it is for any other system in the body. We know that there are genetic variations as well. Some of you might have heard of a genetic SNP. I'm not going to go into that today, but some people have more of a challenge absorbing certain nutrients than other people because of their genetics. What I am going to focus on today is our gut health and our ability to both break down and utilize nutrients in the body and the impact that that will have on our mental wellness. And then I'm going to be giving you lots of tips and advice as well. Now, some of the slides might feel a little bit too much for you. That's fine. I've tried to pitch it somewhere in the middle. Again, as I said, if any of you hear something that you find interesting, but you didn't understand it, do interrupt me. There's something in the chat. Are you able to monitor the chat, Lynn?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I just wrote in there that the chat's open.
That's great. Okay. So let's think about what impacts our ability to use nutrients. So first of all, if the food we're eating isn't great in terms of its nutrient value, then we're not getting the nutrients before they even enter our body. But from when they enter our body, a number of different things can greatly impact how well we get the nutrients from that food. The first thing is our ability to chew and how much time we take to eat. Because if we're not chewing or if we're eating quickly, the food isn't being broken down into small enough particles for us to get those nutrients from it. And then if you think about your stomach as just a big bath of acid, so we chew the food in our mouth and it goes down our esophagus and it hits that bath of acid. And when it hits the acid, it breaks up into loads and loads of tiny pieces, which makes it more readily available to absorb and use in the body. So if you don't have stomach acid, you're not able to break food down properly, so you're not able to get the nutrients. So people that are on PPIs like Gaviscon for extended periods of time, your stomach acid levels can be really, really low, and that can greatly impact your ability to absorb nutrients from food. When things get through the stomach and they get into what we call your small intestine, we release loads and loads of tiny little enzymes. An enzyme is a protein that is like a little Pac-Man that moves really, really quickly. And the pancreas produces what we call digestive enzymes. And what they do is if there is a protein chain, they will just snap that protein chain into lots and lots of little protein building blocks. And those little protein building blocks get absorbed. So if we're not producing the digestive enzymes, we can't break down the food. If we're not producing bile, which is made in the liver and sent to the gallbladder, so if we don't have bile, we can't absorb fats from the diet. And that can have all sorts of knock-on effects because your brain is 70% fat. So we need fat in the diet to support our brain health. And especially in utero and in small children, we really need that high fat. We need a healthy, balanced gut microbiome. When I say a microbiome, that's what I mean there is like all of the bacteria in your gut, because they do all sorts of things, and I'll get onto some of their roles in a little bit. So if anything has disrupted our gut microbiome, like medications or antibiotic use repeatedly, or eating foods that we're intolerant to, then this can really impact our ability to further break down and use the food that we eat. And in addition, the bacteria in the gut actually produce a few of our vitamins. So they produce something called biotin, they produce vitamin K2, and they produce all sorts of other components that we use for energy called short-chain fatty acids. And then it comes to our gut wall. So if we've managed to chew it, we've managed to dip it in the bath, we've managed to break it up, we've got all the enzymes and the bile, our gut wall is covered in what we call villi that look like lots and lots and lots of little fingers. And then on each finger, there's thousands and thousands of little hairs called microvilli. And what they do is massively increase the absorption area in the gut. So if someone has something like celiac disease, or if somebody has chronic inflammation in the gut for any number of reasons, and I'll come on to what some of those are a bit later, then it reduces our ability. It's like all of those little fingers are flattened, and it reduces our ability to absorb the nutrients. Then we've got to think about our state of mind, because if we're in a chronic state of stress, which a lot of people who suffer from mental wellness concerns are, we are what we are called in a sympathetic state. And we have two states. We have our sympathetic state, which is the fight or flight. Here comes a rhinoceros. I better run off and climb a tree. And then we have the parasympathetic state, which is everything's calm. I'm just going to sit down and enjoy my meal. And what's happened with modern society is so many of us stay in that real kind of sympathetic state of mind, like have to rush around, have to do everything. When we're in that state of mind, our body can't break down food and properly absorb it. And one thing that the parasympathetic system does is it causes these lovely peristaltic waves. So if you imagine just these really lovely waves all the way down your GI tract, slowly pushing the food through and helping it be absorbed. This is why we see a lot of constipation in people who are chronically stressed, because they don't have those peristaltic waves. Stress really impacts gut health, and so we can end up seeing people who are constipated, and that comes with a whole other host of issues around your ability to get toxins out of the body, which again further impacts your mental health. So just as a summary, for our mental health to be optimal, we require a lot of nutrients. If we don't eat them, if we don't digest them, if we can't absorb them, or if we can't utilize them, then our general health, and as a knock on our mental health, will be impacted. So to support our mental health, we need a nutrient-rich anti-inflammatory diet. We need a healthy functioning gastrointestinal tract, and we need a healthy, flourishing microbiome, so bacteria in our gut. So what I'm going to run through today, and these words might look scary, but I'll be explaining them all in as simpler terms as I can as we go, is how what we eat impacts our mental health. And I'm going to talk about something called a neurotransmitter. A lot of you may have heard of like dopamine, GABA, serotonin. They're our neurotransmitters. I'm going to talk about cofactors. What I mean with a cofactor is your vitamins and minerals. So it's a function of your vitamins and minerals in the body. And we need to think about our gut health and our gut bacteria and how that impacts our brain. Does anyone have any questions so far, or is everyone still with me? All good? Right.
All good, Kirstie.
Okay, so let's start with the old neurotransmitters. So as I just said, examples of these are dopamine, serotonin. So when people are on an SSRI, these have been developed because of a lack of serotonin. And dopamine is your kind of, happy, excited hormone. A neurotransmitter is like a little transporter of signals between nerve cells, and they are made from protein. So the first tip here is if you don't have enough protein in your diet, you're not going to be able to make your neurotransmitters. But which proteins? So proteins are made from little building blocks. And I've put this image of Lego here because I find it really easy to visualize little protein building blocks as Lego. There's 20 different blocks. So if you imagine 20 different colors of a Lego block, each of those would be a different amino acid. And every single protein in the body is made up of a different combination of these. And some of the structures are really super complicated and some are really super simple, but they're all made from the same 20 building blocks. Of those 20, 9 of them are what we consider essential. And when I say they're essential, it means they're essential in the diet because we can't make them in the body. If we get the 9 essential ones, we can make the rest in the body, no problem. When we're talking about your neurotransmitters, there are 5 of these building blocks in particular that are really, really important. The first and possibly most important is called tryptophan. You're not going to have to remember all this, by the way, I'm just running you through it. Tryptophan is the precursor, so it's the step before, and I'll run through this in a bit, your serotonin hormone. And serotonin is converted into melatonin, which is your sleep hormone. And we know that people who struggle with their mental health often also struggle with their sleep. Phenylalanine is required simply because it's an essential amino acid that's needed for tyrosine, and tyrosine is the amino acid that is needed for the production of dopamine. We've then got taurine and we've got methionine. Methionine's only needed because it helps to build a little cofactor, but it's still essential. And if we're not getting them in the diet, then we're going to have an issue, because a deficiency, and particularly a deficiency in those amino acids, can lead to a decrease in our ability to produce neurotransmitters. So when we look at the sources of these 5 necessary amino acids, you can see that predominantly the sources on this list are meat, fish, dairy, eggs in there, nuts and seeds in there. So really good sources, predominantly of animal protein. So what we then have to think is, if we're working with somebody who is vegan or vegetarian or doesn't eat much protein, we need to think about ways in which we can get more protein into them. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Is everyone still with me? Okay. Easy protein advice. So when we think about the sorts of protein we want to eat, it comes down to 2 factors. One, what has the highest quantity of protein in a serving? And that would be your meat, poultry, fish, egg, tofu, lentils, dairy. Nuts and seeds are also a good source. So on one side, you've got the highest quantity of protein in a serving. On the other side, so that's the quantity. On the other side, we've got the quality. So what we're really looking for is what we call a complete protein. And a complete protein is one that contains all 9 of those essential amino acids. So meat, poultry, eggs, most dairy and fish, and soy definitely are all what we call complete sources of protein. But it doesn't matter if something isn't a complete protein if the meal that you're eating is a complete protein. So an example of this is, there are limiting amino acids, like missing essential amino acids like methionine and lysine. So combining rice and beans means that as a dish, they have all of the essential amino acids. And if you need a little extra, consider a good source of protein powder as well. And I do that a lot with the young kids I work with, especially those that are a bit avoidant when it comes to food. It's easy to get protein powder into them in the form of smoothies usually. So that's always a road you can go down. So the next thing is a cofactor. As I said, these are your vitamins and minerals. So what is a cofactor? I like to think of a cofactor as like a little assistant. So it's a little assistant that is there to help a protein to function. And the protein can't do its job without it. So it's like an essential assistant, as all good assistants are. Like the protein's little PA, if you like. Now, I'm not going to talk through this because it's really scary and horrible. And for anyone that doesn't like biochemistry, you'll probably leave the call. But the purpose of this slide really is, this is just one pathway in the body. And everywhere I've put a star is where you need a B vitamin or one of these nutrients. And this is one little cycle that happens probably tens and tens of thousands of times a day. So I just wanted to use this to kind of give you a really clear idea of how much we need these cofactors, how much we need our vitamins and minerals. We're all told to have our vitamins and minerals, but do we really know why we need them? And we need all of these. SAMI comes from that amino acid methionine, but the rest are all vitamins and minerals. And we need these for the proteins in our body to work. So when we think about one particular pathway for a neurotransmitter, as I said earlier, tryptophan makes serotonin, which makes melatonin. It's just a little chain of reactions. For tryptophan to even get started, we need zinc B1 and B6. For tryptophan to move down the pathway, you've got folate, calcium, zinc, B3, magnesium, B6, vitamin C. For serotonin to move down the path, you've got iron, B6 and vit C. And then for the last step to make your melatonin, again, folate, B6 and SAMe. So you're not expected to remember this, and there's not going to be an exam at the end, but it's really just to show you how important your vitamins and minerals are in your diet. Has something come into the chat? Let me have a look.
Sorry, it was Kirstie. I was talking about protein and vegans, and that was quite helpful.
So veganism, I work a lot with my students on this. It's no one's place to tell a vegan not to be a vegan. You would never tell a Muslim to eat pork. You would never tell a Hindu to eat beef. And in the UK, veganism is a protected ethical belief by law. So when I have people that come in who are vegan, I establish why they are following a vegan diet. And if it is for animal welfare issues, I find ways to support them. Because obviously the most rich sources of a lot of nutrients are meat sources, but there are great sources, and there are ways to mix your foods to ensure that someone who is vegan is getting all the nutrients they need. And it's a bit more complicated. It takes a bit more time and effort, but it is achievable with a good, well-balanced diet and some supplementation to get all of the nutrients that you need for this to happen. So I've put a couple of slides, and I'm not going to read through these. We will be sending out the PDF to anyone that wants it, but it's really just the sources of those vitamins and the sources of the minerals. You can also just go to the NHS page. It's really, really detailed on this. And I took all of this information from this page. So I'm going to move on to gut health. So does anyone have any questions so far about why we need protein, why we need vitamins and minerals, and why they're so important for brain health? Great. So let's have a think about the gut. So when I think about your gut microbiome, I like to imagine it like a city. Like any good city, like London, you've got all of the little boroughs and little groups of people living in their little borough, chipping away. Some run shops, some might work in a factory, some might be bankers. You know, everyone's living in harmony. Everyone is feeding everyone else, right? You know, you own a coffee shop, someone from the bank comes into the coffee shop, he goes to the bank, another business comes to the bank. Like, everyone supports everyone, and your gut microbiome is no different to that. It is a little industrious, harmonious city within you. I heard yesterday in a webinar I was listening to that if you were to take all of your gut microbiome and weigh it, it would weigh the same as your brain, which I thought was quite cool. But then I'm a geek, so, you know. So as with any city, different communities and microbes have different roles. So some make vitamins, some make neurotransmitters, some make short chain fatty acids. They're like little fatty acids that are like food parcels for the rest of the gut microbiome. Some break down fibers, some protect the gut walls, some produce mucus. Like the tasks they have are endless, and there is more and more research coming out on different bacteria all the time. For our mental health to be good and for our general health to be good, our gut health needs to be good. So going back to what I said about with your parasympathetic nervous system, and that's your rest and digest part of your nervous system. As I said, there's two branches. Your sympathetic, which is your fight or flight and your constant stress and making sure everything's okay. And then your parasympathetic, which is your calm nervous system. Your gut and your brain are linked by a nerve called the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve is part of that calming system. So if you look at this picture here on the right, this here coming out of the bottom of your brain, this is your brain stem, and this nerve that comes here that connects to your heart, your lungs, your stomach, your intestines, all the way down. and your ovaries. This is your vagus nerve, and it's one of the most important factors in mental health. And there is so much evidence now in the research linking gut health, and whether that is the microbiome or the vagus nerve or what we call the gut-brain axis that some of you may have heard of, to a wide variety of health conditions. And when we're talking about nutritional psychiatry, that includes depression, anxiety, mood disorders, PTSD, brain fog, insomnia, and many factors on the autistic spectrum as well. I really like this image because I think it sort of sums it up. The vagus nerve is it's like the A47, it's a two-way road. So if our gut is good, our brain is good. And if our brain is good, our gut is good. When the gut is good, we have this diverse diet, we have this really healthy gut microbiome, it produces serotonin, that goes through the vagus nerve to the brain's all happy, everything's relaxed, it produces more dopamine, serotonin, melatonin, we can sleep, it goes all the way back to the gut. It's the opposite of that when we are highly stressed or when our gut microbiome isn't balanced. So how do we stimulate our vagus nerve? So there are actually little stimulators that some people have fitted for various reasons, but you can stimulate your vagus nerve yourself. And you can do this in a number of ways. You can do it by singing, by humming, by gargling, acupressure and acupuncture, yoga, qigong, Pilates, but particularly certain yoga poses, deep breathing, can all help to put you in a parasympathetic state. They can really help your vagus nerve. They can really help to calm you. And actually, I recently watched a webinar by one of my students who was talking about the link between singing and heartbeat. And when people sing together in like a choir, heartbeats sync to 60 beats a minute, which matches the Earth's magnetic field. Isn't that a fun fact? So it can be really important. So all of these things, anyone that does suffer a lot from anxiety and stress, you know, trying to do some of these things in the day can be really beneficial. And when we stimulate our vagus nerve, it can also really help with constipation because of those peristaltic waves going on. So in terms of your microbiome, so this is really important. 90% of the serotonin that you use is produced in the gut. It's produced by your enterochromaffin cells, which are cells in the gut. So if you don't have a healthy, balanced gut flora, you can eat all the tryptophan you like and you're not going to be making any serotonin. The microbiome can be really negatively impacted by a number of factors, and I'll be talking a little bit about some of these, but highly inflammatory foods, I'll explain what they are. Certain medications can impact our gut bacteria, particularly antibiotics. As I said, antibiotics are essential if you have a really bad infection, but when we take them quite frequently, they can have a really negative effect on our microbiome. Environmental factors, as I mentioned, but also, as I said, stress and anxiety can be really, really, really disruptive for the gut microbiome. So it comes back to that cycle that we've got to try and find an in, and we've got to try and break that cycle, because poor gut means poor mental wellness means poor gut. So top tips for gut health. So eating foods that support our gut microbiota. I'll explain what these foods are. Things like bitters, so I'll show you what I mean by a bitter. A wide variety of what we call phytonutrients, so that's really the nutrients that we get from plants. Prebiotic foods and probiotic foods, you've probably heard those terms, and I'll explain what we mean by them. All of these can have a knock-on effect on our mental wellness. Reducing intake of inflammatory foods and instead having loads and loads of anti-inflammatory foods can really help our gut and help our mental wellness and just help our body in general. Avoiding antibiotics unless necessary, and aiming to keep our environment as clear as possible of toxins, making sure we're getting outside in the fresh air where possible. And I'm going to explain the importance of this on mental health in a few slides' time. And then,
Kirstie, can I just ask, can stress and anxiety trigger intolerances such as dairy at all?
So yes, and intolerances to dairy and such can trigger stress as well. So it can go both ways. But generally it's the food that is the impacting factor on our gut and then on our stress levels and mental health. But it can go the other way as well with certain foods, because, you know, if your gut is imbalanced and it just keeps going round in a big circle. So if your gut is imbalanced, then you're not able to absorb those foods, and then they're present, and then they cause more inflammation, and then it causes more damage, and then it sort of just keeps going round in a circle. Did that answer? Okay. Anyone else have a question at this stage?
There's a question about caffeinated tea. Let me just have a look.
I know I drink too much tea.
I drink too much tea. Can I claim decaffeinated as a win, or should I be getting rid of that too?
So one of the biggest tips I have for people in terms of sleep quality is to not drink caffeinated tea from lunchtime onwards. Caffeine has an 8 to 9 hour half-life, meaning that 8 to 9 hours after you've consumed it, half of the caffeine is still in your body. I hate to tell you, but that includes dark chocolate as well. So I recommend actually moving over to decaf as a win with you. There are some things in tea that can affect absorption of certain foods. That might be for another lecture, but the tannins in tea, they can bind to iron from plant sources, so they can lead to issues with iron absorption, and they can bind to zinc and other nutrients. So usually if I recommend having a cup of tea, I recommend not having it with a meal, especially if you're vegan or vegetarian and all of your iron sources are non-meat based. But there's a research supporting tea for a lot of health conditions. It's full of phytonutrients, green tea especially, which I'll talk about, and coffee as well. So there's arguments for and against having caffeine. There's arguments for and against having tea and coffee. It's also complicated. Don't ever become a nutritionist. Any more questions? This stage? Yeah, and then focusing on your stress, of course, because the more stressed you are, the more of an impact this will have on your gut health, and the more impact it has on your gut health, the more impact it will have on your brain health. Cortisol is really inflammatory across every system in the body. It's a fat-derived hormone, so it will steal its ingredients from all other fat-derived hormones, which includes your sex hormones, your thyroid hormone. It can be really, really disruptive when, like a little dripping tap, it can impact your blood sugar levels, which leads to further inflammation. It can impact weight, and it can impact mental health greatly. So focus on the stress levels. So I won't read through this entire list, but if you look under beverages, you'll see tea. When we're talking about bitters, mostly we're talking about like the herbs and spices and cruciferous vegetables, salad leaves, but there's others on the list as well. Bitters are really good for stimulating stomach acid and supporting gut health. Bio to what now? I mean, I think you've all heard of probiotics, prebiotics is so much the fashion now, right? So you see it everywhere, like get your probiotics. So a prebiotic, which are mostly fibers found in vegetables and whole grains and fruits, they are like the food or the compost for your gut bacteria.
The question in the chat there, Kirstie, about herbs. Just asking if dried herbs are okay or if fresh herbs are better.
Both are good, depends how old the dried herb is. If you dry them yourself, it's better, but herbs are actually, gram for gram, one of the most nutritious foods out there, packed full of phytonutrients. I always recommend fresh where possible, but dried has its place too, and also teas and oils of herbs as well. So yeah. But you know, if you can grow your own and take it straight from the plant to the pan, then that's the most optimum. And I'll be talking a bit about teas and stuff in a bit as well. So a probiotic is a healthy, friendly bacteria that lives inside your gut. But when you're taking probiotics, they don't really stay in your gut. It's not like you take a probiotic that's like 10 billion lactobacillus casei and it stays. But what it does is it's almost like really happy people floating through a town and making everyone in the town feel happy when they've gone. You know, they don't stay, they're very transitional, but they change the flora of the gut to a more friendly one, or at least that's the theory. And they can be massively beneficial, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the strains that we know are massively beneficial for mental health in a bit. A postbiotic, so this is the latest fashion, is something that the bacteria produce. So in my clinic, for instance, if I'm working with people who have a really disrupted gut microbiome, I might recommend giving them something like short chain fatty acids because they don't have the bacteria to produce them. And so we'll supplement them until we can improve their gut bacteria. And then a psychobiotic sounds like something you would have taken as a teenager when you shouldn't, but in fact, all a psychobiotic is a bacterial strain that is specifically supported in the literature to support mental wellness. So they're all of your biotics. So when we're talking about prebiotic foods, these are the sort of main ones. A few things on here that some of you may enjoy, a few that maybe you haven't tried, maybe worth giving a go. Some flaxseed in there and wheat bran, a few, this side is mostly the sort of roots and the carbs, and we've got some of the more common vegetables and a couple of fruits here as well. And then a probiotic food, so that is usually a fermented food. It's a food that contains probiotics, which means it contains live bacteria. You may have heard of these, you may have not heard of some of them. If you're opting for things like, if you're opting for kombucha, make sure it doesn't have added sugar because sugar feeds bacteria, which I'll get onto in a moment. And there's other sources here as well. In the literature, so this is what I was saying a minute ago, so there is so much research. I had pages and pages of this to bore you with, and I cut it all out because I thought if anyone wants a more intensive academic webinar, we can arrange it, but I won't do it to you on a random Thursday night in March. So differences in the composition of gut microbiome biota in patients with depression it's very different compared to the gut microbiota of healthy individuals. So we know that there are certain strains of bacteria, whether it's strains that are missing or strains that are highly present, that are linked to various mental health issues. And that's like linked to PTSD, linked to depression, linked to anxiety, as I said, linked to autistic spectrum conditions. It really is such a growing area of research, and in the last 10 to 15 years it has exploded, and there are papers coming out every day, and we are learning so much about how specific strains of bacteria can help our gut and therefore our mental health. So certain probiotics are associated with improvement in well-being, decreased anxiety, depression, and psychological distress. There are certain bacteria, first of all, that can produce some of those neurotransmitters, and also something called brain-derived neurotic factor, which I won't go into now, but it's basically something that the brain really needs. So the strains that we often see in the literature are lactobacillus, particularly rhamnosus, various strains of bifidobacterium. This here, the Escherichia, that's actually, like, often you see it as E. coli, which everyone goes, oh my God, E. coli, it's so terrible. But E. coli 0147 is terrible, but there are strains that are just prevalent and really beneficial, and Enterococcus. Just a note to always speak to a GP or nutritional therapist before taking any supplements. If you have a really healthy gut bacteria and you add in probiotics, you can lead to overgrowth in certain areas. So it's definitely not something to just start popping. If you're going to start trying to up your pre and probiotics, do it through food. So my top tips in terms of nutrients for supporting brain health are your proteins. Definitely omega-3s in the form of what we call DHA and EPA. They are derived from fish, particularly fatty fish. That's what we call SMASH, which is sardine, mackerel, anchovy, salmon, and herring. They're your most rich sources. You can also get vegan DHA and EPA in the form of algae. You can also get, there's a system in the body for converting like the omegas that you get in like seeds and nuts to DHA and EPA, but the conversion rate's only about 10%, but it is a possibility. These are the nutrients that are the cofactors, so zinc, magnesium, copper, iron, calcium, and then the B vitamins and vitamin C, and then choline. So we get choline in salmon and eggs, and it is massively, massively important for brain function, particularly in utero. And it's something, again, if people aren't eating enough protein, they're just not getting enough choline. So what should we be adding in terms of foods? So an anti-inflammatory diet would be one almost like a Mediterranean diet, really brightly colored. So fatty fish, brightly colored fruits. So berries and cherries and grapes are really rich in all sorts of antioxidants and anti-inflammatory agents. And then ginger, cinnamon, and turmeric are all also anti-inflammatory. We want the biggest rainbow we can have of vegetables and fruits, really, and the most anti-inflammatory fruits and vegetables are broccoli, peppers, mushroom, and tomato. We want healthy fats in our diet. We're moving away in nutrition from the low-fat message. Olives and olive oil are so anti-inflammatory. Nuts and seeds are packed full of protein, fiber, fats, nutrients. Avocado is massively nutrient dense. Adding in those high protein foods, the pre and probiotic foods. Dark chocolate is a really good source of a lot of nutrients, and it's also anti-inflammatory, but it's high in caffeine, so if you're going to have a little bit, try not to have it too late. And green tea is full of antioxidants, and it's also really high in something called L-theanine, which is known to reduce anxiety. So I'll mention that again in a little bit. But again, if it's after midday, find a decaf version. I'm just checking the chat.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions waiting for you to pause so I could hop in. Someone's asked about brain fog fixes, please, and what would you recommend? And they've said they've taken lecithin.
So lecithin, so when I was talking about choline, lecithin is a source of choline, so that can help. In functional nutrition, it comes down to what is causing the brain fog. So it could be an imbalance in the gut. It could be gluten. Gluten is a massive gut trigger, and it has a real knock-on effect. It could be an iron deficiency. It could be hormone related, could be menopause related, it could be thyroid related. So there are so many different potential causes for brain fog. Menopause, yeah. So again, that's almost like a whole other talk, but it's about supporting your hormone pathways. It's about supporting your gut, because when you are constipated, your liver breaks down and gets rid of estrogen. And if you imagine that your liver is like the Lawton waste disposal site, and everyone takes their rubbish there and dumps it. And then once a day, a truck comes along and it takes the skip and it takes all that rubbish and it puts it somewhere. So the waste disposal site, that's like your liver, and that truck that comes along is your bowel movement. So if you can imagine, if everyone like threw their rubbish in Lawton skip and no truck ever came along, it would just be packed full of toxins, and those toxins would start to seep into like neighboring fields. That's what your body's like. So if you don't have bowel movements, you can't take the toxins away. And one of the main roles in menopause of the liver is to break down the estrogen, which becomes slightly, there's 3 types of estrogen, but in menopause, it's sort of a bit of a harmful one. And we need to break it down and get it out of the body. So that's the first thing. So all this stuff on gut health should also really help with your menopause. There's certain phytonutrients and botanicals you can take to support menopause. I would say don't eat gluten for 4 weeks. See if your brain fog's better, and if not, give me a call.
Kirstie, there's another question in there about what your opinion is about vitamins and minerals, and should we have that via our diet rather than supplements?
So I work with people clinically who are quite unwell. So I do often supplement them, and often quite heavily at the beginning. If you are well, if your health is good and you're eating a really healthy, balanced diet, then it's likely that you're getting the majority of the vitamins and minerals you need from your diet. But if you are unwell, it's possibly because you nutrient deplete. So again, there's testing that can be done through the GP or privately to look at your nutrient status. It depends on the time of year, it depends on your dietary preferences. So there's lots of different things. Magnesium, barely anyone gets enough magnesium, because 400 years ago, we used to like pull tubers out the ground, lick them clean, eat all the soil, and then just munch into them. These days, everything that comes from magnesium depletes soil, and then we scrub it completely clean. And so we lose a lot of the magnesium, because we used to get the magnesium from soil. So that's something I often recommend people have, and I'll get onto that in a bit. Vitamin D, of course, we live in the UK. Any higher than this, the government recommends vitamin D, but then if you're not having vitamin K2 or magnesium, there's no point in taking the D, because you can't convert it and use it. So so I would say it depends, but generally speaking, especially a B complex isn't going to cause any harm, because B and C are what we call water soluble. So they go into the body and they go out of the body, and they're not really stored. But A, D, E, and K are stored. So there are toxic upper levels of those. But by taking just a standard vitamin mineral, it's highly unlikely that you're going to overdose, except possibly on iron. And so that depends whether you require iron. That's a whole other conversation too.
Thank you. There's just another question's come in about asking your advice on, can dairy impact behaviour? Yeah.
I mean, if you have an intolerance to it, and if it's changing the balance of your gut flora, like there's so many reasons why dairy can be rejected by the body. It can be to do with the protein. It can be to do with what we call the FODMAP fibers. It can be to do with not having lactase enzyme, but it can lead to diarrhea and bloating and all sorts of gut health issues that then cause inflammation in the gut, that then impact the microbiota, that then impacts the gut-brain axis. So I would say indirectly, yes. I work with a lot of kids, and actually a lot are quite intolerant to dairy, and there's a lot of research looking at removing gluten and dairy from certain diets of certain children with neurodiversity, and that it can impact them positively in terms of their gut health and then their brain health as well. We're gluten-free, I'm calling you. Looking forward to the chat. Everyone, I do a free 15-minute chat for anyone that wants to call anyway, but yeah, there's lots of factors involved in brain fog. So yeah. Okay. So then we talk about what to reduce and remove. So we need to think about all the things that cause inflammation, because if we're saying we want you to add in all of the things that prevent inflammation, all of the anti-inflammatories and the nutrient-dense foods, we've got to think about removing the inflammatory foods. Sugar being one of the biggest culprits, refined carbs, additives, preservatives, processed foods, so processed meats, processed fat, vegetable oils, some seed oils, trans fats, anything from a takeaway, anything that's sat in plastic for a long time is going to have the residue of the plastic, which is an environmental factor that can block pathways. I've just ruined everyone's weekend. Foods and additives that are causing sensitivity and intolerance. So there we've got the gluten, egg, dairy, soya, the most common foods, and then sweeteners, thickeners, and additives. And then alcohol, and especially in excessive amounts, can be quite harmful to the gut microbiome as well as the liver, so preventing the ability to detoxify. So the first thing I usually do when people come into my clinic, depending on what their diet looks like initially, is get them to follow this healthy plate model. This is my clinic version of it, but this is a model that dietitians use all over the world. And it's just trying to get people to make sure they're getting all the nutrients they need. So the idea is that 25% of the carb plate is protein, 25% complex carbs, 50% vegetables with some fruit. I usually recommend 2, maybe 3 servings of fruit a day because of the fructose in it. Making sure it's the better choices of fruit, so the berries and the cherries and the lower sugar versions. And then some healthy fat on the plate as well, focusing on hunger rather than calorie requirements. I won't go through all these, but in the slides I've just put a few meal ideas for like really protein-rich, nutrient-rich breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, and snacks. I said earlier that I would get back to herbs and dried herbs and such. So there is a lot supporting these in terms of anxiety reduction. So first of all, magnesium, which you can get in Epsom salts, spray, cream, supplement. The recommended upper dose of magnesium is 300 milligrams a day-ish. And I wouldn't go above that. And I'd usually go for a glycinate, unless you have like bladder pain, which might indicate high oxalate levels, and then I'd go for taurate, and if you're constipated, magnesium citrate. That said, once again, always speak to a GP or nutritional therapist before taking supplements. Epsom salts and magnesium, so you know, a good therapeutic bath with like 4 cups, 5 cups of Epsom salts then would be great. L-theanine, which comes from green tea, is anti-anxiety and it helps with sleep. And then there's a couple of teas or oils, so lavender or chamomile or lemon balm particularly is really good for anxiety and mental wellness. There's a few supplements that contain some of these that I recommend for kids and young adults who are quite anxious, and we've seen a lot of positive change. Can't emphasize enough the importance of connection, and whether that is with friends or family or both. Supporting your friends and family's mental wellness is really important. So that might be promoting activities that stimulate the vagus nerve, so singing, humming, hugging, laughing, breathing, replacing screen time with family activities. From the earliest age, encouraging children to speak about their concerns and worries. We live in this society where everyone has to be okay all the time, and it's not okay to be not okay. And if you say you're not okay, people will automatically say, don't worry, you'll be okay soon. But actually, you know what? It's absolutely okay to not be okay. And we should be encouraging children to talk about the fact that they're not okay and give them the floor space to just verbalize that, because otherwise we all end up with the guilt of not feeling okay. And then we go and eat a load of processed food. We feel even worse. I do this a lot with my kids that I work with, is wins of the week, to just really promote positivity. So even on a bad week, you know, we just like, give us the wins of the week, like 3 wins of the week. Eating together, talking to isolated relatives, really making the time for people in your life who may not see that many other people, particularly with the pandemic, it's been important. And consider if any elderly relatives are getting the nutrients that they need and the impact of that. Think about their teeth. Think about whether they're able to chew. Think about whether they can swallow. Think about whether they're producing stomach acid. Think about their ability to open foods. So, you know, can they open a can? Can they understand a cooking instruction? So lots of considerations for elderly. I think there's some questions coming. Let me have a look. Okay, right. It's okay, fish and chips come in the newspaper. That's right. You get to sit and read, calm yourself down as you eat them. I've put some breathing exercises in here. I won't go through these, but they're pretty self-explanatory. I like the box one because if you have a stressful work environment, you can actually do this on your hand. You don't have to draw your box like this. You can just go in, hold, out, hold on your hand or on your leg under your chair. No one will see you doing it. In terms of the most researched breathing exercise to instantly reduce the anxiety, it's this one. So it's a deep breath in, and when you feel like you can't breathe in anymore, you take a last short breath in and then you exhale. So it's like, there's all of these other ideas here too. You can have a read through and get some tips for calming yourself. Early morning sun exposure is essential. If you can get out in the early morning and stare at the horizon, it does so many different things. First of all, your cortisol levels will come down and your melatonin will be triggered. So we wake up with high cortisol and low melatonin, and throughout the day, they do this. And hopefully by bedtime, your melatonin's high, your cortisol's low, and you can go to sleep. And the process for that is triggered in the early morning or in the morning. We need the sun exposure for vitamin D. But in addition to this, every cell in your body has a circadian clock. And when you go outside in the early morning light, your brain registers that it's daytime. It's like every little clock in your body reprograms to the time. So if you're not getting out in the early morning, your body doesn't really understand what time of day it is or what's going on. And of course, fresh air and nature can be calming. And if you don't have a dog of your own, come take one of mine out. I'd really appreciate it. Lastly, sleep quality. We know that people with mental health issues often have insomnia and broken sleep. These are my top tips. Again, I'll send the slides out. If anyone wants more, I've got millions of sleep tips and ideas that will work. But my number one suggestion would be getting outside in the early morning and probably removing the blue light. And just this quote from mine to finish on, which is, if we all do one thing, we can change everything. So thank you, everyone. I hope people are still awake, or maybe you could just come to these and I could send you to sleep, and then I'd be helping your mental health.
Thank you, Kirstie. Thank you so much for this. Your knowledge is just beyond all recognition, really. Certainly, as a keen neuroscientist myself, I just loved it, and the application is huge. So just to say a big thank you, then I'm going to stop the recording. But thank you ever so much for coming, and then we can take questions.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I lecture to my students, but like I said, to get to do something for the local community means a lot to me. So I really appreciate Miles inviting me and you arranging it, Lynn. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
I hope it makes up for me missing my spot on the mental first aid course because I got the day.